Hello students, welcome you all. Today let us look into a subject called nutrition communication. We'll take a public health perspective. Nutrition communication is becoming very important day by day, especially in a country like ours where there are problems of undernutrition as well as growing problems of overnutrition, overweight and obesity. Nutrition communication is becoming a very important public health approach to make people aware of the problems of nutrition, to make people aware of good diets, to make people aware of what they have to eat and what not. So nutrition communication is a very broad subject, but for the benefit of the learners today, we would like to divide this nutrition communication into two broad topics. In the initial first part of the topic, I would deal with some basic concepts of communication and then basic steps that one would take while designing a communication process. In the second part of the lecture, I would actually deal with some approaches to nutrition communication, including social marketing, advocacy, health education, edutainment and things like that. So dear students, at the end of this teaching module, we will try to learn why, what, where, when, who, and most importantly, how of communication. We'll try to define communication and then the features of communication. Let's try and define communication. Communication by the basic dictionary meanings would show you that communication means exchange of information, ideas and feelings, succeeding in conveying one's meaning to the others, passing on opinions, feelings and ideas. But there are also some definitions which say communication is a process of transmission of information, attitudes and emotions from one person or a group of persons to another. In the earlier three definitions, what I said, there is a commonality. I request you to just observe the words exchange, conveying one's meaning to the other, and passing on opinions and feelings, while the second meaning talks only about transmission. So usually when we try and define education, education is a didactic process, whereas communication is a two-way process. With the words exchange, conveying one's meaning to the other, we arrive at a conclusion that there are two parties and communication always gives consideration for two parties. The person who sends out the communication and the person who receives it. So the basic tenet of communication, unlike education, is that it is not one way. It is not somebody raising oneself on a higher pedestal and telling that you don't know anything, I'll teach you. This in a way takes communication in a broader sense to define that communication is a two-way process which involves a sender and a receiver. A sender actually identifies some information and makes it into a message. A message is then encoded, and encoding means message has to be converted into a method that is suitable for the medium that has been chosen, and then after encoding a message, it is put into a channel that is accessible to the receiver, and the receiver takes the message through the channel, and the process of taking the message through the channel and understanding is called decoding. The earlier methods of theories of communication have shown that there is a message, that the message goes from the sender to the receiver. It was assumed that if the sender sends out a message, the receiver would take the message and then would immediately start acting accordingly. Whatever we do in terms of health and nutrition communication is for a behavior change, but just sending out a message and somebody receiving a message doesn't ensure that one changes one's behavior so easily. Before we go into the aspects of behavior change through communication, we need to realize that just sending out an information and then receiver receiving the information doesn't complete the process. We'll now take a look at a simple model of communication which takes a complete cycle from sender to communicator. The message goes through a channel to the receiver, and then once from the receiver, it has to complete the process of feedback, again come back to the sender to complete the process of communication. Otherwise, We would just communicate, and there is a danger that the message communicated by the sender is not received by the receiver appropriately. So with the process of feedback, we try and see that whether the receiver has understood the message in the way it has to be understood or not. So the basic components of a communication are a sender, a message that is encoded to suit the medium or channel that one has chosen, and from the channel it is received by the receiver, and the receiver decodes that information and tries to understand what the sender has sent. And once this process is completed, from the receiver it has to go back as a feedback. So there are basic features of communication. I'll simplify these basic features into four broad features. The one is that we have to understand that any communication takes place in a context. We cannot assume that communication takes place in a vacuum. If communication were to take place in a vacuum, whatever a person would tell the other person, that is whatever the sender would tell the receiver would immediately act the way the sender wants him to act. But it doesn't happen in real life. It happens in a context. Why I say context is that there are many socio-economic, cultural components that influence the way a person receives information, deciphers it, and then acts or doesn't act accordingly. And then we have to understand that communication is a very dynamic process, and it has to be very proactive. Dynamic, why I say, is that communication has to change from context to context, person to person, community to community, and problem to problem. Communication cannot be the same. A communication process or a method that is devised at one central locale cannot be used for entire country. There are no umbrella solutions in communication. Communication has to be pinpointed, targeted, and it has to work and take into consideration the concepts of a person's socio-economic and cultural milieu. And then what we have next is communication is very interactive, and communication, we say, is irreversible. So one has to be very careful when communicating. When the process of communication starts and the receiver receives the communication and understands it, it cannot be reversed. We can only try and correct it, but communication once made cannot be reversed. And then there are some common concepts that we usually come across when we talk about public health related communication. Usually the words communication and information are used interchangeably, but we'll understand that communication is a process while information could be a resource. For instance, you want to talk about iron deficiency anemia. There are 100 things about iron deficiency anemia that one can talk. Why and how iron deficiency anemia happens, what are the nutrient sources, what are the sources of iron, what are the food sources of iron, and how to combat iron deficiency anemia, in which age groups it comes, and many other things one can talk. However, from all the gamut of information that you have got, you pick up a particular message that is suitable according to the problem of that community. For instance, if you are dealing with adolescent girls, you will have to know what exactly is the problem that is causing anemia among adolescent girls. So we pick up only those messages that are suitable for that community and then target the adolescent girls, whether it is eating more of iron rich foods or eating more of vitamin C rich foods for absorption of iron. So that process of picking up the message and putting it up in the method or media that we want, and then sending it out to the receiver, and the receiver completing the feedback process, is called communication. That's the reason why I say communication is a process, while information is entire gamut of ideas that we've got. They say there is power in communication, which means the communication gives out message, it builds knowledge among people, it empowers people. That's the reason why they say there is power in communication. And there is a little difference between sender and communicator, which are often used as interchangeable terms. A sender is a person who actually sends out a message, who wants to reach the receiver, whereas a communicator always need not be a sender. Communicator may be somebody who acts on behalf of a sender. For instance, you're working for an organization which wants to work for the development of nutritional development of a community. That organization wants you to communicate a few messages to the people. The organization becomes a communicator. You working on behalf of the organization and trying to take the message to the community become the communicator. Similarly, there's a difference between message and content. Message, as I said, is some part of information, entire information that you've got, that you pick up to reach out to the community, while the content is how that message is done according to the medium. For instance, you want to talk about iron deficiency anemia among adolescents. As I said, I am repeating the same example that I gave you earlier, that if you were to talk about promoting iron-rich foods among adolescent girls, the message is eat more of iron-rich foods. But if you're putting it in radio, you would change the content in a different way. If you're putting it in television, you would put more of iron-rich foods, show all of these iron-rich foods, and could say eat these foods. If the same message were to be delivered, as I said, in radio, you would say, green leafy vegetables are iron-rich foods, and this particular food has iron, so please consume these foods. So the way you make the message to suit the medium is called a content. And then there are always effects, effectiveness, and consequences of communication. Effects are what the communication is resulting in. Effectiveness is how good is your communication in taking the idea that the communicator wants you to take. And then consequences are what the audience does after knowing your information. Then let us know why at all nutrition and health communication should be done. Of course, true, it is to be done for promoting public health. But usually when public health communication is done, it is assumed that it has to be done only to change the behavior of the people. We understand that people's eating habits, eating patterns, and what they are eating, what they are consuming, and the nutrients that they are getting may not be adequate. So we want to change their behavior to promote healthy eating. But nutrition communication and health communication do broader work than just promoting behavior change. Sometimes communication has to be done to reinforce, because any message given once will not materialize into behavior change. It has to be reinforced. The television related advertisements and other things, or any advertisement that you see in newspapers do, they repeatedly give the same message so that it gets into the head of the person. And then once the message is reinforced again and again, the individual tries to believe it as a reality, and then there is a possibility of changing the behavior. And then sometimes communication should also aim at changing the social norms, because there are many social norms, for instance food fads and myths, that actually hinder a person from changing one's behavior. So communication can sometimes be not only for promoting healthy eating, but also the other factors which in turn promote healthy eating. So in the sense that to change those social norms, you have to communicate. And communication, as I said, empowers people. Communication has to be done to empower people. That is, there could be some nutrition related information that people do not know. For people who do not know about nutrition or health related information that you want to pass on to them, you will pass on that information and then make them information rich, so they are empowered. And then communication has to be done for mustering support. That is, to bring about a change in the community, to bring about a change in the eating patterns of an individual. You may not only target your communication to the individual always, but you may have to target the communication to the people around that person who influence the person's eating behavior. For instance, if you want to change the eating behavior of a child, you may not, it is not always possible to target to the child. Sometimes even if you target the communication to the child's eating habit may not change. So you may have to target the mother or the father who buy provisions, who buy the vegetables, who cook for them. And similarly, if you want a pregnant woman to take, say, iron and folic acid tablet, the pregnant woman may want to take. You may communicate to her and she may be convinced with your communication and she may want to take. But if the mother-in-law doesn't let her take, then it would be a problem. So your communication may have to aim at a person who decides whether the daughter-in-law has to take that iron folic acid tablet or not. So therefore, communication is not always targeted at the person whose behavior you are trying to change, but also the other people who can influence the behavior change of the person, or to get support of those people to communicate to the target audience eventually. And then, but we'll have to agree that any nutrition and health communication has certain flaws, certain difficulties to overcome. That is, communication, the health and nutrition related communication doesn't interest many, because many people would think, oh, we've been eating like this for many years, nothing has happened to us. Why these people are coming and telling us new things about how to eat and what to choose in terms of eating? And then it makes, so with all this, it makes eating and living very complicated for them. And then we'll tell them to include this particular nutrient. We may tell them to include a particular nutrient rich food. We may try to include, ask them to avoid eating certain things that they were hitherto eating, and many more such things would ask for their behavior change, which doesn't interest many people. And then we always talk about behavior change when it comes to nutrition communication. In the sense, the ultimate aim of nutrition or health communication is to change the behavior of the target audience. We may target communication to secondary, tertiary audience also. But finally, what happens is we want a certain behavior change in lifestyle or eating patterns of the targeted person. So it always talks about behavior change. So when you talk about behavior change, people don't immediately like it. They may not take it very positively sometimes. And the audience may feel it is not his or her cup of tea. For instance, the example that I gave you about a child, you may ask a child to eat carrot, but child may like to eat carrot after you have communicated and convinced the person. But it is not the child who buys carrot at home, it is a mother who gets carrot at home. So the children may say, okay, we are ready to change, but it is not in our hands. So they may feel it is not their cup of tea because they are not decision makers, they have limited powers to change, and their economies and infrastructure also influence whether they can change their behavior or not. So in that context, how to convince them, how to make our nutrition communication interesting? So as a nutrition communicator, you have to convince people first that it relates to them and their health. And you have to tell them that they can change things. It is not so difficult to change things. And do not stress on their flaws when you are talking about communication. Always tell them what they are. First, you never start your communication by telling them what they are doing is wrong. You have to emphasize on positive changes that you want in their life, but it doesn't mean you point out their negatives and then tell them. In that, if you try to do that, the nutrition communication may not be too successful always. And most importantly, instead of just telling them or lecturing them around, make them do things, help them practice things. Once they practice, once it gives some positive benefit to them, then they would definitely take your communication and then change their behavior. Health and nutrition communication has always relied intensively on interpersonal communication, IPC, not Indian Penal Code, but interpersonal communication. So interpersonal communication is still the very basis for health communication in any country that you take. Interpersonal communication can happen at various levels. A person talking to the person, a person talking to many people in a group lecture, or a doctor or a dietitian talking to a patient in a counseling session. And interpersonal communication still holds key for nutrition communication because it becomes more targeted and problem oriented communication. But however, it is not enough. If you were to talk about nutrition communication to one person continuously, the person may get bored. So it is always better, even in interpersonal communication, to add some more media. Take help of slides, take help of posters, take help of folders, take help of certain other material that will help you reiterate, that will help the audience to divert their concentration and try to understand. Okay? And also we should understand that no one medium is mass medium. So if you're thinking that you have chosen one mass medium, so-called mass medium called television or maybe radio, and they're assuming that it is reaching everybody, probably you're mistaken. You need a multi-component kind of intervention in these days of rapid growth of communication technologies to reach out to many people in terms of communicating nutrition. So how to do it? We have to set clear objectives, and we have to understand how to go about doing our awareness campaigns. For that, what we need to do is we need to understand who's to be tackled first. So as I said earlier, any communication cannot be directly targeted at the beneficiary always. Sometimes you may have to target at people who influence the person's decision making, or sometimes you may have to target at a group in which actually the person lives, to help the person change the behavior. So we have to understand who has to be tackled first and what is to be conveyed first. Going back to the example of anemia, what is to be conveyed first? Should we talk to them about taking iron supplements? Should we talk to them about taking iron-rich foods? Should we talk to them about stopping iron absorption inhibitors like coffee and tea? Or should we talk to them about taking more of vitamin C foods so that they help in absorption of iron? That entirely depends on your basic understanding of the audience and the audience problems. And then you will have to know what you want to achieve with IEC. At the end of doing this communication, information or education or communication, what exactly are you trying to achieve? Is it the behavior change, or is it getting somebody's support to help in changing the behavior of a patient? That objective you have to have very clearly in your mind so that you will understand who is to be tackled first. And we have to change objectives according to the knowledge, awareness and attitudes of the people. It is wrong to assume that people do not know what you are trying to tell them. People may be already aware of many of the things that you are trying to tell, but there could be certain factors which are hindering them from changing their behaviors or moving towards healthy behaviors. You have to understand those and then try and give them knowledge related to them. That is most important. That's the reason why I say you have to change your objectives of communication according to the existing knowledge, attitudes and practices of the people. And most importantly, once you design your communication method, once you design your messages, once you choose your medium, do your messages in a way and then try and pre-test them with the target audience. So that pre-testing is nothing but trying out with similar audience who are similar to the actual audience that you want to talk to. So by doing pre-testing, that is by trying it out on a smaller population and seeing whether the communication is achieving what it has to achieve or not, you would avoid larger mistakes. Otherwise, communication is a very costly affair. Public health communication, that too, is a very costly affair because, as I said, it involves multi-components and not just interpersonal communication. So you do develop communication material in a large way and then go to the people and then suddenly realize that it is not functioning. It is a colossal waste. So it avoids costly errors. In order to avoid costly errors, one has to pre-test the messages, pre-test the material and pre-test the medium also with the targeted audience. There are other methods of communication other than interpersonal. One can think of the visual method, where visuals speak more than what the person intends to speak. And then there are interactive ways of communication wherein you involve the audience and then try and talk to them and then understand their problems and then give solutions from within their context. And then there is a play way in which you can make people play while playing they would learn about the things that you are trying to focus on. And there is food for thought. Food for thought is actually making them do certain things and try and understand certain things, asking them to find out about a particular nutrient, or asking them to find out about the nutrients that are present in their regular foods, asking them to find out their own flaws in their own patterns of eating, asking them to come out with solutions for their own issues. We've also thought of something called local folk media, which are present even in today's context of all new media that we've got. The folk media can still be effectively used, especially in rural areas, where if we can use folk media by introducing nutrition and health related messages in them, they will also go a long way at least. And of course, you all know about special events, and we also know about the special events. We know about the National Nutrition Week, we know about the National Breastfeeding Week, and we also know about Women's Day and things like that, wherein on those events we would actually do a large scale activity in order to grab people's attention to the issues related to all these topics, so that people think how important are these, a thought process is triggered among the people to understand the intensity of the problem and then to look for solution at least by a big mega event. And the simple and most important thing that one has to remember is we should never undermine span of attention of the audience. In the growing, in this age of various media and growing media technologies, the attention of individuals has become really short. One cannot spare more time to you. So your messages have to be extremely sharp and extremely crisp. Therefore, we'll have to assume that people will pay very less attention to the messages. In the time that they pay attention, they'll have to understand, or our medium should grab their attention and get them to understand what we are trying to say. We should also remember that people understand very selectively, they retain also very selectively, and they memorize also very selectively. That means they understand only what they want to understand, they'll retain only what they want to retain, and then their memory will be sharp with only what they want to retain with them. So we need not be distressed with this. We need not be distressed that all the communication that we give, people have remembered only few aspects of it. But it is part and parcel of communication. That's the reason why we say, since people's understanding is very selective, try and understand what is to be targeted to them. That becomes most essential in public health communication. And then there are multiple uses of communication. Innovation, that any innovation, any new thing that the people are given, they may use it for any purpose. For instance, you may give them a flip chart or maybe a small pamphlet on nutrition, but you have to make sure that that is being used to read and understand that. If it is being used for something else, then the purpose is lost. So in order to do that, what would you do? You would have to go back to your audience, get feedback from them, try and understand whether they know it or not, they understood it the way it has to be understood or not. So getting back to audience in regular and short intervals is the most important thing in communication. If you go back to audience in regular and short intervals, you will get an idea whether your communication process has been successful or not. If it is not successful, where it has to be changed. So the mid-course correction is possible only through going back to audience in short intervals. That is a process of feedback mechanism and also monitoring and evaluation of your entire communication process. So students, let us summarize and take home a few key messages from the lecture that we have learnt just now. We'll try and understand how nutrition communication has to be designed. In order to understand that, the key points that you have to take home is that before deciding or devising any communication, you will have to understand your audience thoroughly. You'll have to understand the existing knowledge, what are the attitudes of the people, what are the behaviors that have to be changed, and in what context the audience are operating, the socio-economic, cultural context of the audience. At the same time, you also have to know your sender very well, know the communicator very well, on behalf of whom are you trying to communicate, and what is the key nutrition message that you want to send out on behalf of your sender to the audience is what you have to clearly understand. And then you choose your media and messages accordingly and very carefully. And choose your target audience also very carefully. It is not always the beneficiary who could be the target audience. It could be the people who influence the ideas of the beneficiary can also be the target audience. And understand, in today's changing world of technology, the span of attention is very limited. When the span of attention is very limited, one has to be very clear, very crisp, very focused in terms of communication. And once such communication is designed, you will have to pre-test the message, pre-test the method, and pre-test the medium, and pre-test the message through the medium to the audience so that you don't make any costly errors. And at the same time, you understand feedback is the quintessential element of communication process. So you will have to try and understand from time to time whether the audience have understood the message in the way or not, whether they have liked your communication or not, whether your communication is feasible for a behavior, whatever you have said in your communication is feasible for them to change their behavior or not. And finally, remember the context of communication and remember the nature of communication, that communication always takes place in a context, it is dynamic and proactive, and it is irreversible. So be careful in designing communication and be a successful nutrition communicator.